With the release of Fontaine, we might finally have some hints regarding the final elements of Genshin Impact. We are of course talking about the new Arkhe system relating to Pneuma and Ousia, I think that's how you pronounce it, which suspiciously coincides with the concept of light and dark elements that we suspected in the past. But how can we be so sure that these are the elements that will be implemented into the core parts of the gameplay? Because on one hand, the developer clearly said during the live stream that these new mechanics only pertain to the region of Fontaine, but on the other hand, we've seen hints of this before with the Traveler, the light energy emitted by the Traveler on several occasions, to the dark element from, I don't know, Dead Gods, the Abyss, the Forbidden Knowledge, and obviously Daneslave. And everyone at this point probably would agree that Daneslave will be a playable character in the future. So to answer the question of whether these elements in this Arkhe system will be a core mechanic in the future of the game and not just Fontaine, we have to look at it in several different angles, so to say. First, how does Numa and Ousia even make sense in terms of lore? Because we know everything in the game goes back to the lore. That's just how they've been doing things. Second, I noticed a certain pattern that the developers use for certain things that they will include in the future of the game. And finally, if these elements do become playable in the core parts of the game in the future, what would they look like? So let's begin with the lore. As I just mentioned, when anything gets added to the game, they need to have a reason surrounding lore. Basically, to have everything make sense so that it's not so random. One of the biggest examples of this was the ley line outcrop. I think in the beginning, I suspected that there might be some lore regarding the outcrops, but then people started calling me insane and, oh, this is just a mechanic for farming materials. Well, we later learned that ley lines retain memories of the past events, and it also has the ability to display these past events so that we can re-experience them, which is in line with the lore if we think about the concept behind the Irminsul tree. The point that I'm making, everything in the game has a connection to the lore or the world building in some way. And I believe that the new Arkhe system with Pneuma and Ousia, it's literally no exception. So to help us better understand, let's look at what these things even mean. What is Arkhe? What is Numa? What is Ousia? In the most simple definition, Arkhe means the beginning or the origin, which has a lot of context already in the game because we learned from the book Sun and Moon that before the birth of the Primordial One, the light and dark realm already existed, and it was only after the war between the Primordial One and the 7 sovereign elemental dragons, Teyvat was created, along with the elements that we know today. That would suggest that this new light and dark elements of Numa and Ousia predates everything we see of Teyvat, giving an obvious context to the name Arkhe, which means the origin. Moving along, a quick search of the definition behind Numa and Ousia also have context to the story as well. Numa means either soul or spirit, and Ousia can be interpreted as to be, or a being, or something of substance. Simply put, the definition regarding Numa and Ousia can be interpreted in an easy way of just meaning body and soul. So what does this mean? You know how the entire goal of the Traveler is to reunite with the sibling to understand the truth of this world? When we take the philosophical approach and try to understand this essentially reflects the idea of syzygy, or enlightenment, within Gnosticism. The reunification of what we perceive to be opposite will destroy or break free from the worldly perception. And similarly, when the energies of Numa and Ousia meet each other in the game, they nullify one another. Or as the developer puts it in the live stream, the concept of annihilation, which again could just mean that it's breaking free from the materialistic world and actually being enlightened. Now, before we go too crazy into all this religious and philosophical aspect of things, if you don't understand any of it, it's fine, because I know it's complicated, especially if you don't have like a deep understanding or deep exposure to all this kind of things. But if you do want to know more about this, I'll link something that is very good to read in the description or the comment of this video. It becomes very clear that this Arkhe system was intended from the very beginning from the perspective of the developers, and it's not something that they just cooked up in the lab for the sake of having something fresh for the release of Fontaine. Fresh. Nice. Now, aside from the lore, there are a couple other things that I found rather interesting about the inclusion of these Arkhe system and why I believe that these two primordial energies of light and darkness, or Numa and Ousia, will likely show up in the future of the game.
Stars align, bestow your light, evil purged by thunder's might. Spirit curbed, Numa surge, Numa surge.
the developers not only hint about the lore stuff in advance, but also they do this thing with the mechanics of the game that I found very intriguing. For example, you might remember when Child was first released during the live stream, the developers talked about how they wanted to test and try a new system that explores with the different unique multi-stand combat system. Now, this is just purely my speculation, but since they tested that, we have characters like Xiao, right, and Shogun who have similar multi-stand combat system within their ult. Now, that's just a small example, but if you fast forward to Fontaine, especially with the underwater exploration and combat, that's something they might have also tested before, especially with Sarush. I don't know if you remember the world quest from Sumeru where this little pink thing is flying up and down. Really, it only lacked the animation portion of swimming underwater, and the aerial combat system, or what we would compare to underwater combat system, was kind of tested with Scaramouche or the Wanderer. Now, there's two ways of looking at this when we consider what the developers are doing. One, they're either testing things so that they can implement things later that is similar, or two, they're kind of getting us comfortable in a different aspect or mechanic of the game that might release in the future. Not only do I find this interesting and suspicious, we now have this weird situation going with Neuvillette where it should say Vision is no longer Vision, it's just question mark and it just says Hydro. Does that mean Neuvillette is potentially one of the first few characters that we're gonna get in the game that doesn't have a vision but also being playable? Is he gonna get a vision? I don't know, but if he doesn't, it might be very suspicious that a character is now getting introduced to the game that doesn't have a vision alongside the same time frame that this Numa Ousia primordial energy element system is introduced as well, and that's very interesting in my personal opinion. But the bigger question in all this is, let's say they are planning to incorporate it into the game in the future in some way, shape, or form. If that happens, what does Numa and Ousia look like if it gets implemented? Now, throughout this video, I've been using the term element or energy to associate it with Pneuma and Ousia, because when it comes to elements, that's what we're more used to in the game of Genshin Impact. But if we go into Honkai Impact 3, we might get a more of a better understanding of how everything works together if Pneuma and Ousia, or the Arkhe system, becomes a playable portion of the game in terms of mechanic. In Honkai Impact 3, elements do exist. There are things like fire, ice, and electricity. But really, the core gameplay revolves around what we call types. There's bio type, mech type, and of course psi type. And these three things operate on more or less a rock, paper, scissors system. But in the game, there are two more things that we call types of imaginary and quantum. Now, if you look at it on the aesthetic perspective, light is clearly imaginary and darkness is clearly quantum. And if you know anything about Honkai universe, which Genshin Impact is a part of, it's safe to assume a lot of these things derive from the concept of imaginary tree and the Sea of Quanta. But before we derail in all this aspect, let's go back to the mechanics. In Honkai Impact 3, there are possibilities of a character having elements with either imaginary or quantum. What does this mean in terms of Genshin? There might be a possibility that while a character has an element, let's say for Pyro, Hydro, Electro, but on top of that, an inclusion of either Numa or Ousia. And we know this because it's been given to us literally in the game with Lynette, Lumine, Lyney. If you look in their profile of the skills that they use, it says Numa aligned or Ousia aligned, which makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, there's a possibility that it won't turn out this way. Of course, the light and dark, or Numa and Ousia, could be their own respective elements. But I find it highly unlikely only because when Dendro was released, the element to reaction chart was just like maddening. I still don't know how most of this shit works. If you, on top of that, it's not that I don't think the developers have the capability of doing it. It's more like when you do it that way into an element to reaction with additional 2 elements, like I honestly think it's too complicated to make and too complicated to play. Now, on a different note, we could argue that maybe the imaginary and quantum, or Numa and Ousia, maybe they're not even related. But the thing is, if you look in Honkai Star Rail, it's made very clear that that's like a mainstay typing of energies that is incorporated into the Honkai universe. And in Genshin, it's also there. They're just named differently because of the perception of Genshin Impact's lore. What's more interesting is the fact that in Genshin Impact, we call these 7 elements, but there is one more that a lot of people forget, that is actually considered as a typing rather than an element, and that's of course the physical typing. So all in all, what I think could happen, the 7 elemental reaction might just stay, and all it is different typings on top. One is obviously physical, as we already mentioned, one is imaginary or Numa, and one is quantum, which is Ousia, and they just help amplify things in terms of how they're played. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment down below about whether you think I'm insane or you have your own opinions about this. I'm very interested in finding out, and hopefully in the game we learn something more so that we can get a better understanding of if this is even a possibility. You guys are awesome, and I'll see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye bye.